Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Review. My name is Caleb Denby, and today I'm going to take you through a game by the world champion Magnus Carlsen against his trash-talking rival Anish Giri. Of course, these two have been known to get into it on Twitter over their various chess skills. Who can forget some infamous tweets by Magnus Carlsen, such as, win a tournament for the first time in your life, and maybe then people will take you seriously. With all of that backstory, let's jump into this game, which was played actually in the finals of the Chessable Masters tournament, part of the Magnus Carlsen Tour, named after the man himself. And in this game, Magsy Bogues played the move 1d4. We have knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, arriving at the Nimzo-Indian. And I believe this is the only time Magnus played into the Nimzo-Indian in this match. Nowadays, at the top level, you do see people try to avoid the Nimzo with a move like knight f3 here. They have been opting for more standard QGD setups lately, rather than go for the Nimzo-Indian with knight c3. And then Magnus actually had a really interesting idea. Now there's a ton of different ways white can play against the Nimzo. There's the classical with queen c2, defending the knight with the queen. There's e3, going for a more solid approach in the center. There's knight f3 for the two knights. There is the f3 Nimzo, my personal favorite, bishop g5 for, I think, the Leningrad. But Magnus plays a sideline, a pretty serious sideline, with the move a3. And this is a move that just immediately clarifies the situation on the queen's side, forces black more or less to capture this knight on c3. And I had always thought that this a3 line was just a little bit inaccurate for white, to be honest. The reason for that is that you get very similar positions out of the f3 Nimzo, but with f3 included, you make black sort of make one more move, make one more decision before you go ahead and kick this bishop away. So for example, if a move like c5, you get d5, and then all of a sudden this bishop doesn't have the retreating square. And if d5, well then it's not so easy to go for the dark square setups that black can normally get. With a3 immediately, now the situation is totally clarified, and after bishop takes c3 and b takes c3, black has not yet committed to castling for 1, and he has not yet committed to any central breaks for 2. And so the way that I had kind of been told, or taught, or learned over the years to play against the a3 Nimzo is to quite simply go directly after this c-pawn. You can kind of contrast this line with the f3 Nimzo, where black will sometimes castle, a3, takes, and now knight e8 is actually the main move here. The point being, the bishop pin is rather awkward with the king castled kingside. The reason for that being, if you don't play this way, and you just go ahead with b6, suddenly it becomes rather awkward to try to drive this bishop away with things like h6 and g5. Now you can compare this line with a3 immediately, and followed by b6. Now, if white ever goes for this bishop g5 business, suddenly the move h6 and g5 is a very satisfying way to sort of block this bishop out of the game. And so this, I think, is kind of the most principled way to play against the a3 Nimzo-Indian with black. The point being, you highlight the fact that white has not made you castle with the move order involving f3, and now you have very simple play going against the c-pawn with your minor pieces and playing c5, opening the c-file, bringing a rook to the c-file, and play can continue very naturally from there for black. Now Anish Giri chooses a different setup with c5, and I think this is actually slightly more common, but to be totally honest, I think it makes a little bit less sense for black here. The reason being, you can get sort of better positions from the c5 business if you play against the f3 line first. So it sort of makes sense to play the optimal version of whatever you can, in my opinion at least. That being said, c5 is by no means a bad move by Anish Giri. It's a perfectly acceptable opening line. Magnus continued with the move e3. We had knight c6, increasing the pressure to white's center. Bishop d3 is the natural developing move. We have d6, and now Magnus decides to develop this knight. In this line, this knight is not really aiming for the f3 square. The reason being, the setup that black has adopted is very much playing against this knight's various hops, and so it comes to e2 instead. Also notably, if it lands on f3, you have some concerns about a potential e4 push later in the game for black. So knight e2 instead, aiming for the g3 square to control these squares a little bit more thoroughly. Black continues with the move e5, which is very sensible, just challenging this center further. And then we have knight g3 by the world champion, Magnus Carlsen. And then Giri plays a move which I am actually quite willing to call a pretty serious mistake here. In some variations, for example, let me just put something on the board here. You can imagine castles, f3 for example, let's say b6, castles, and now the move h5 would be very, very standard in this position. The reason being, this knight on g3 can very easily be pushed away by the move h4, and with white having castled and played the move f3, the move h4 in response doesn't make a whole lot of sense by white. This pawn is just going to be weak, and white does not actually have access to the h5 pawn himself. And so you'll see h5 in positions like this, and it makes a ton of sense here, because you're forcing this knight to do something awkward, like come back to h1 and back out to f2. Now in this position, Anish Giri also played the move h5, but here I do believe it makes a lot less sense. The reason being, these two moves for white have not been included. f3 and castles, not included here. And because of that, the move h4 actually becomes quite a strong reply for Magnus Carlsen. Now this pawn is backed up by this rook on h1, and after queen e7, Magnus Carlsen makes a very, very logical decision here. He needs this rook on h1 to defend h4, which means this king is going to be chilling in the center for some time now. So Magnus immediately makes an effort to close the center with the move d5. And this is a very, very nice idea by Magnus. He doesn't want to castle the king anymore, so he still works to make his king have a safe home, and that safe home is just going to be in the center by locking it down. And now Anish makes another pretty serious mistake here. I don't know if he realized how severe the danger he was facing here actually was, because after his move, knight b8, which is fine if you're going to move the knight, the issue is that now Magnus can get a pretty seriously winning advantage with the move e4. Anish simply couldn't allow Magnus to totally lock down the center in this manner. After e4, white is just dominating in the center and dominating on the king's side, and very quickly Anish is going to realize that this pawn is simply indefensible. So because of that, Anish's really only move to maintain the balance here was to play e4 himself. You have to take this space while you can. Then if d takes c6, e takes d3 is doing totally fine for Anish, with these pawns looking rather awkward. And if this bishop simply moves back, I don't know, to e2 for example, now the move knight e5 comes on the board, and this knight is sort of a monster here on the e5 square. And it is actually black who is going to be having a significant advantage. Bishop b1 might try a little bit harder, highlighting that if knight e5, we do get this pawn, but it's sort of irrelevant to the position because this knight is so strong that black is more than willing to give up his e-pawn for it. In fact, the c-pawn is going to die in almost every variation here. So e4 would have been a nice find by Anish, but after knight b8, e4 by Magnus locks down this idea, and now the black pieces simply have no room to breathe. The move bishop g4 was played, and now simply f3 by Magnus, not giving away this g4 square. And after bishop c8, this kind of really highlights the dire situation of Anish Giri's minor pieces. None of them have any squares. This knight is looking at nothing. This bishop has no developing moves. This knight can come to d7 and maybe b6, but it doesn't do a whole lot there. And it's just pretty dire straits now for Anish. Bishop g5 was Magnus Carlsen's move, developing his piece or his final minor piece to a good square. And now after queen c7, simply bishop takes f6 and g takes f6. Notably, if a move like knight b to d7, simply knight f5 is kind of the issue that's coming. This is why queen c7 appears on the board, just to get this queen out of the way preemptively of knight f5 business. So queen c7 takes, and now the pawn structure is bad for Anish as well. Now with the diagonal closed with the pawn on f6, Magnus is happy to castle as the rook is no longer needed here. Now knight d7 comes on the board, and white to move and get a serious advantage here. If you want to try to find out at home, go ahead. Of course, this move is f4, just breaking open the f file and once again highlighting the weakness on h5 now that this bishop is temporarily unable to get to g4. And this is the issue with just having less space, as Anish did in this game. Your pieces start stepping on each other's toes. E takes f4, and now of course Magnus could capture on f4, but he wants the h5 pawn instead, making sure that this bishop is not landing on g4. Knight e5 was the move by Anish, but now knight takes f6 comes with check, king d8, and rook takes f4 is quite simply extra material for Magnus. He is up 2 pawns here, no less. And now knight to g6 was Anish Giri's move. And once again, I'd like you guys at home to try and find Magnus Carlsen's next move. It's a pretty instructive one showing how to value your pieces in this type of position. So go ahead, pause at home if you want to try to find it. The move, of course, is not to move this rook away, because if you move this rook away, Anish Giri is going to take on h4, and honestly, this knight's coming back to e5, and Anish is in there sort of with a fighting chance. You know, he gets this h4 pawn back, and his pieces start to spring to life. So this h4 pawn is much more valuable than an exchange in this case. So Magnus, in an attempt to keep this material, plays the move queen f3, just defending the rook. And now if rook takes h4, this is pretty much unplayable because at the end of the day, this queen is invading. For example here, the killer move e5. And knight takes e5 means queen h8 check. And black is sort of just getting checkmated here in short order. Even rook e1. And all the pieces are surrounding the black king. This bishop can't move because of this rook. And it's just sort of devastating. So rook takes h4, prevented by the move queen f3, but of course Anish could capture this rook. Instead though, he plays the move queen e7, not yet capturing, and after h5 now forcing black's hand, we do see knight takes f4 and queen takes f4. Anish now tries to trade down a little bit to ease his spatial woes with queen e5. We have queen takes e5, d takes e5, and the move g4 is very natural. And Magnus's compensation for the exchange is these 2 killer passed pawns on the king's side. a5 was Giri's choice, trying to find some way to get this rook active. We see g5 by the world champion, rook a6 now, getting active with this rook, and then Magnus actually makes a pretty serious mistake. Oops. And now Magnus actually makes a pretty serious mistake. Oh my gosh, I've ruined everything, Danny. And so after rook a6, the world champion actually makes a pretty serious mistake here. It's an interesting mistake for him to make, considering how in the previous position he was so ready to give up the exchange in order to maintain these pawns that he seems to have not considered black doing the same thing, giving up the exchange to remove these pawns. So by far I think the best move here for Magnus is to play the move bishop e2. And the point of this move is it overdefends the h5 pawn, and this is relevant because now the move rook takes f6 is not going to be any good for black. This h5 pawn stays on the board, and now without the extra exchange, he really has nothing for it. Now you can compare that with the move played in the game, rook b1, eyeing to stop the rook b6 idea, but now after rook takes f6 and g takes f6, we have rook takes h5, and all of a sudden black is very much in this game with a very active rook and with the threat of the passed pawns being eliminated. And this really does throw away almost Magnus's entire advantage here. Much better was to play the move bishop e2, when black now, of course, wouldn't sacrifice the exchange, and he does get the move rook b6 in, but it's not totally relevant, right? We play the move king f2, we get our king in the game, and you can imagine very quickly, rook g1, g6, g7, g8, and then the game is just going to be over. So it's an interesting mistake for Magnus to make here, allowing his opponent to sacrifice the material back in order to get a fighting chance in this endgame. But we do see rook b1, and Anish immediately snaps on f6. We have gf6, rook takes h5, and now rook b5, Magnus getting active himself, but he sort of has to win this game all over again. Rook h3 is now challenging the pawns from behind. We have bishop e2, rook takes c3, rook a5. This rook now hops over to the e3 square with a fork. We have bishop h5, a pretty clever move by the world champion, going for the more relevant pawn on f7 rather than worry about trying to save these pawns in the center and on the queen side. And actually, this is probably a mistake by Anish going after e4, when instead the really only relevant pawn in this position for the moment is this pawn on f6. Because of that, the much better maneuver for Anish was to play the move rook g3 check, king f2, and then come up to g6, just ensuring this f-pawn is going nowhere fast. Getting this guy off the board and then sort of remaneuvering, recouping in this endgame. Notably, he's going to keep at least 3 pawns, and so he might end up down a pawn with some scary pawns in the center. For example, rook takes c5, rook takes f6, king e3, for example. But now after a move like rook a6, black is definitely very much not doing poorly in this case. So Anish missed an opportunity here to pick up the f6 pawn. After rook e3, white is back in the driver's seat with this nice move bishop h5. f7 is just too important. Rook takes c4 by Anish, and now rook a8 is the very, very clever move by Magnus Carlsen. Notably, if bishop takes f7, you're falling for a little bit of a rook g4 trick. If you go this way, we have rook h4, and eventually you're going to have to step to the f-file, otherwise there's a repetition. And the moment that you do, we do see the move rook f4 check with a capture on f6 to follow. Of course, you can't go to h3 because of, well, not that move, but rook g6 check would pick up this pawn as well. So, not bishop takes f7, as I said, guarding the g4 square instead. And now we do see the move rook to a8, pinning this bishop. King c7 is black's attempt to unpin, but unfortunately now the story is a little bit different. We do see the move bishop takes not bishop takes f7 rather, but there is another key idea here. Notably, the only reason this repetition works is because this bishop is defending these squares. So Magnus finds a way to make sure that bishop doesn't defend those squares. If you want to try to find it yourself at home, go ahead and pause here. If not, the answer, of course, is this nice move d6 check. Of course, if king takes d6, you're running into rook takes c8, so king d7 instead. But this is the go-ahead now because this bishop is no longer guarding these squares. Magnus can now take on f7. We have rook g4 check, and the king just walks up the board. Not even rook h4 check, when king g3 would leave black with no checks. Rather, we do see the move rook f4, king g3, and now rook takes f6 does come on the board. But as I said, a very different story here with these pieces so awkwardly placed. The move bishop h5 is just devastating here. There's simply no way to untangle these pieces and prevent white from simply capturing on c8 in the coming moves. For example, if you play king d8, trying to step out of the check, well, still bishop g4, and this bishop is pinned. You cannot remove this king anyway, otherwise rook takes c8. You cannot even try to defend the bishop with rook f8, because bishop g4 check still makes the king move away or block off the rook. And so Anish Giri here simply losing a piece, and with it the game. We have bishop g4 check, bishop takes c8, and now Magnus picks up on b7 as well. And it's just a matter of time for corralling these pawns in the center for Magnus. Getting his king back, and now after a4 and rook takes c5, we see bishop c2. And with all of the pieces for white coordinated, this pawn is dropping and this pawn is promoting. Anish Giri simply resigns here. So a very nice game by the world champion with two very interesting exchange sacrifices being featured. Definitely an interesting opening debate, and I do think Anish will live to regret playing this move h5 so early on in the opening. This is what gave Magnus the advantage, in my opinion. Well, thank you very much for joining me on this episode of Game Review. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.